everybody. Thank you for coming. My job is to do a welcome to the conference, Radical Cartography Now. My name is Susan Smulyan. I'm director of the Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage at Brown. I'm going to try and remember not to wander and to use the mic for a range of reasons so everyone can hear, and so because we are we used to say taping. We are recording the proceedings for all the hordes of people who couldn't make it in. I want to begin with thanks, as I usually do, to Sabina Griffin, to Connor McDonald, to Jim McGrath, and to Monica Martinez, who started it all, and most of all to Marissa Brown. Can we give Marissa a hand for all the work she's done in organizing? I want to thank in prospect all the speakers who've come so far and so near to join us. We appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules. Everybody's got a busy life these days, and you've given us a whole day and to share your thoughts and ideas, and we really appreciate it. Special thanks to Gwen McGregor and Sandra Ricicchio, who have put up a great exhibit, Map It Out. People in Providence have made maps. And they've been all over the city of Providence this week. And you can see those maps down at the Nightingale Brown House, 357 Benefit Street. They're up 9 to 5 in a wonderful exhibit until November 14th. We would like to acknowledge that we're on the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples. For faculty, staff, and students of the Center for Public Humanities, we continue to especially appreciate our collaboration with Rhode Island's Tomahawk Museum and Brown's Native American Indigenous Studies Initiative, especially the fellowships awarded to one student a year in our MA program. As I said, I'm the director of the Center for Public Humanities. The center brings together students, faculty, practitioners, and communities to explore the ways to make the humanities meaningful and accessible. We have a 2-year MA program in public humanities with amazing students who do exceptional work. We have some fellowships available, so we hope you'll send any students who might be interested. I got a wonderful brochure. There's some outside. There'll be some up front. If anybody has students or are themselves interested in an MA program, you could ask me about it, or you could ask one of the students. Any of the students in public humanities? They're mostly sitting outside. Students in public humanities, raise your hands. They're mostly outside helping at the table, so you can find them out there. So each year we convene a conference on important work that examines collaborations between communities and scholars, work that troubles those two categories. We try for intersectional work. We seek out people who talk about race, gender, sexuality, and class as they overlap. We're pleased that this conference and these speakers do that and more. Even just looking for a name for the conference got me thinking more deeply about the importance of spatial naming and framing. And then I thought, why didn't we call it naming and framing? But we spent so long thinking up names. And so anyway, I like that name, but now I know that Marissa would say no. And I do like the name that Marissa finally chose because it helps us think of the importance of our work in the presence as well as naming our approach to this work. And all of our work, the work we do in the university, the work everyone's doing in their own communities is very important today. And I thought to end with a paragraph or a couple of sentences about how this work is so important as we push forward in just this moment. And I couldn't do it. The news was just overwhelming, and I couldn't come up with something that summed it all up. But I know this is something that the speakers are going to talk about, why this work's important, and how it's going to help us figure out a way forward. And so I'm just going to let them do that hard work. So thank you very much. Welcome to everyone. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Parker Van Valkenburg, who's a faculty member in the anthropology department, and he'll introduce our keynote speaker. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you all for being here. It's been a distinct pleasure to be really the most minor of characters in the organization process for this really exciting conference. And I just wanted to echo my thanks to Susan to the originators of the conference and everybody who's worked so hard on it. And also express just how excited I am to be introducing Professor Shannon Mattern, who is professor of anthropology at the New School for Social Research, somebody whose work I've both taught and admired for a really long time. Her writing and teaching focus on archives, libraries, and other media spaces, media infrastructures, spatial epistemologies, and mediated sensation and exhibition, including sensation and exhibition mediated by maps. She's the author of the books The New Downtown Library, Designing with Communities, Deep Mapping the Media City, and most recently, Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, all of which are published by the University of Minnesota Press. And I know that Shannon's been speaking about this latest book for the last couple of years and may have tired of it, but it's been something that I think that has been really transformational for my own field, synthetically bringing together the work of media scholars and media archaeologists with that of actual archaeologists. And I believe that among non-archaeologists, you may be the most archaeological friendly of scholars. We normally just get used as a metaphor, but you've actually used archaeology as a perspective in order to interrogate the deep history of the urban spaces that we occupy and the way that we represent them. So in addition to her long-form writing, she contributes a regular long-form column about urban data and mediated infrastructures to Places, a journal focusing on architecture, urbanism, and landscape. And she collaborates on public design and interactive projects and exhibitions. You can find her work at wordsandspace.net, along with a really inspiring set of syllabi that I have admittedly pilfered from on numerous occasions. Today, Professor Mattern's talk will be entitled Map Washing, Co-opting Civic Design. Please join me in welcoming Shannon Mattern.
This thing is a trick.
So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for being up at 9 on a Friday morning. And thanks very much to Marissa, to Susan, and to Parker for the warm welcome. So this is a talk I wrote for this occasion and for a separate conference on planning. So it combines themes related to radical cartography and planning. All right, so here's my title slide. So for the last decade or so, I've taught a variety of classes on mapping, inspired by the radical cartography of folks like Bill Rankin, Lizzie Vogel, who's here today, Laura Kurgan, and Marco Ferrari, by the participatory processes of Bill Bungie, Dennis Woods, Kate McLean, May-Po Kwan, and by the critical data visualizations and map art of people like Catherine D'Ignazio, Georgia Lupi, Josh Begley, Yanni Lokissis, Tiffany Chung, Bushra Khalili, Nina Kachadorian, and the Office for Creative Research. I've worked with a couple hundred students to translate their research projects and idiosyncratic obsessions into interactive maps and hybrid format atlases. I've documented and expanded on some of this work in my little tiny book, Deep Mapping the Media City, and in a variety of articles and book chapters, and on the websites I've created for each of my classes. Those courses and related writings have led to my invitation, as Parker said, to collaborate and consult on some really great critical cartography projects and mapping exhibitions. And while I'm still a steadfast believer in the creative and critical potential of mapping as a method, and of all the radical political power of participatory mapping, I also have developed a few reservations. So first, I've observed that digital, participatory, and particularly open source maps present great challenges with regard to preservation, maintenance, and labor. Content moderation, bug fixing, and general upkeep wear people out. In a few cases, as with the full open stack humanistic mapping platform I worked with colleagues to build over the course of 5 years, we simply gave up, ultimately. Second, my collaborators and I have noted, as have many critics of participatory GIS projects among indigenous and marginalized communities and populations in the Global South, that standard digital mapping platforms, which do tend to minimize some of those other concerns about maintenance that I mentioned earlier, they present their own challenges. They impose methodological and epistemological limitations, forcing users to transform complex spatial phenomena into machine-readable points, lines, and areas, and to adopt a spatial ontology defined by Euro-American geopolitics, settler colonialism, and a teleology of territorial control and property ownership, including among populations, for example, space does not equal property. These concerns were made particularly acute when I was recently asked to respond to an edited collection documenting various crowdsourced activist mapping projects rooted largely in the Global South. As I wrote in my afterword for that book, which is if it's according to schedule, should be out next year, the rise of digital mapping tools, from consumer GPS devices to Google Maps and OpenStreetMap, has famously opened up cartography to a wider public. For that expanding cartographic community, maps have become an everyday presence, customized and pocket-sized. And more importantly, the wider public now has the capacity to make their own maps, chronicle their own spatial experiences, model their own worlds. Those marginalized populations who had historically only been cartographic subjects, native populations of colonized territories, recipients of aid from global development organizations, redlined communities, and other inhabitants of the margins, now themselves wield the digital sextant. Sextant, it's a hard word for me to say. Women, people of color, the impecunious, and victims of both historical and contemporary injustices can plot their individual and collective lived experiences and validate their own ways of knowing. These are often data that are of little value to commercial cartographic interests. And through this autocartography, the editors of this collection note, these populations can potentially hold governments accountable, fill gaps when infrastructural and municipal services are fragmented, call attention to a variety of issues that impact everyday lives, such as sexual or political violence, environmental injustice or corruption, and make visible social and political processes and events that might otherwise be hidden or overlooked. End quote. That was a long quote from the afterword. So there is much to celebrate in these developments, yet we are now at a point in the history of participatory GIS and crowdsourced mapping when we can reflect critically on such projects, the ambiguity or ambition of their initial goals, the constraints of available tools, the limitations of their reach or impact. Stephen Rattle and Matthew Anderson, in a recent article in Progress in Human Geography, acknowledge that while participatory GIS has succeeded in advancing, or advocating that is, for the incorporation of more marginalized groups into planning and governmental decision-making, such projects have historically dealt pretty poorly with conflict, often offered little opposition to entrenched power brokers, and created minimal disruption for neoliberal agendas. We should question, they propose, the degree to which people's participation actually shapes outcomes beyond having their input coded on a map. Critical reflection on participatory mapping's capabilities and limitations, particularly regarding its use among indigenous populations, indicates that we need to anticipate the map's desirable and intended consequences and its undesirable unintended consequences, and to develop clear protocols before we start plotting points. I'd add another new contextual concern. In an age when mapping and spatial practices like design and planning can be automated or rendered generative by responding to data harvested from the immediate environment and its inhabitants, perhaps even without their explicit consent, what does it mean to participate? What happens when a map becomes merely an intermediary between automated data extraction and algorithmic urban engineering? Amidst all the promises of data-driven urbanism and smart cities and responsive architectures, we should be aware of how state and corporate entities are deploying participation both as a means to substantively inform and offer critical resistance to their proposed plans, and as a public performance wherein the aesthetics of collaborative mapping and civic design serve to signal democratic process. So for decades, as federal agencies and municipal governments have sought to encourage public participation in urban planning, they've turned to maps, models, games, and other playful, designerly means of soliciting and validating public spatial knowledge, and ostensibly using that insight to inform design and planning processes. But as cities increasingly turn to private technology contractors to manage urban infrastructures and development projects, their proprietary platforms and processes are often obscured. Can civic design tools like participatory maps and community engagement apps meaningfully inform these often obfuscatory processes? And I understand here in Providence you have some partnerships with self-driving car companies, as do most companies have municipal partnerships with proprietary or with corporate tech companies. Or are these models susceptible to co-optation or map washing by design-savvy tech developers who've mastered techniques of discursive engineering through their virtual platforms? Can participatory planning methods stand up to algorithmic and neoliberal planning? To address some of these questions, we'll begin with a case study that exemplifies the mixed modalities and materialities of participatory mapping and planning. We'll then look at a few additional community planning and digital justice projects that deploy maps with mixed results. Unless you fear, this is going to be an absolute bummer of a talk and a regrettable start to our day, I will close by exploring some counter-mapping practices that reclaim the map's radical potential, often by positioning the map as a part of a larger cartographic assemblage. Throughout the day today, too, we'll see roughly a dozen other examples of mapping projects that exemplify cartographic resilience, that demonstrate the radical potential of low-tech, open-source, community-based maps in a world of ubiquitous surveillance and tracking, a world of universal addressability, a world haloed, that is, by a swarm of all-seeing drones and satellites, a world populated by data centers containing massive repositories of proprietary geodata, and by the devices constantly pinging our locations to sentinels in the cloud. A hand-drawn map can actually stand up against all of that. So several months ago, on an afternoon featuring both spits of snow and auspicious bursts of early spring sun, I walked with a group of fellow infrastructure aficionados into a former fish processing plant near Toronto's Portlands. The building at 307 East Lakeshore Boulevard East, now painted a vibrant cerulean blue, is Sidewalk Lab's experimental workspace, where the company, which is Alphabet, nay Google's, urban innovation unit, solicits and tests ideas for the smart neighborhood it hopes to build in nearby Quayside. The development project, a partnership with Waterfront Toronto, which is a multi-scalar government organization covering local, provincial, and national governments, has faced significant resistance, as you might have noticed if you've followed this project at all. Critics have challenged the terms of the public-private partnership, the opacity of the development process, and the lack of clarity over data governance. Given the obfuscatory nature of Sidewalk's closed-door deals and proprietary technologies, it might be surprising that they've adopted a relatively transparent, intelligible, accessible tools of civic engagement, or maybe we could say self-defense. Paper and ink, models and maps. The 8,000 square foot double height primer white open space featured an assortment of unassuming analog media, Post-its, index cards, and rough models, amidst scaffoldings of unfinished plywood, chipboard, and cork. Its aesthetic was resolutely lo-fi and DIY. As Vanessa Quirk noted on Sidewalk Lab's Medium channel, when the space opened, quote, the concrete floors have been ground down, but not perfectly finished, intentionally so. The columns, once covered up with drywall, have been stripped to reveal their graffiti-lined skeletons. The rough space, architect Luc Bouillon explained, looks like something you would be testing a lot of stuff in. Humble sawhorse tables hosted an array of annotated cards, each offering feedback or questions from fellow 307 co-designers. A nearby stack of blank cards and a pile of markers called upon us to add our own voices. A question I have about facial recognition is, we were prompted, how will sensors and cameras be used with regard to safety or security in data collection? One visitor responded. Nearby, an efficient unit prototype, a sample apartment made of cardboard, which you can see on the left, invited visitors to annotate its features with colored Post-its. Corridor too narrow for wheelchairs. I like to look at something while I cook, another person said. Paper signage was affixed to walls, tacked to bulletin boards, or hung from movable metal dividers. These layered sheets of white and pastel, which resembled an interface designed in accordance with Google's signature stacked card material design system, mixed simple stencil and sans serif typefaces to tell us about everything from the project concept, job creation, and Ontario's timber industry, to Sidewalk's proposals for data use, environmental sustainability, accessibility, and social infrastructures. Trained Sidewalk liaisons roamed the room, engaging in casually scripted conversations with their guests. At other times, the space hosted scheduled workshops and forums where a chorus of voices registered their interests in and concerns about the waterfront development and the city's future. Embedded among the paper text and illustrations was the occasional screen, where we could explore maps, videos, animations, and Sidewalk's bespoke design tools. One such tool, which earned its own kiosk that is, was Common Space, an application developed in collaboration with advocacy organization Park People and the now-defunct Gell Institute to facilitate public life studies, that is, the observation of how people use public space. Inspired by urbanist Jan Gell's own empirical methods, the tool would allow researchers to bypass the traditional clipboards and clickers and instead input data directly into an app that was calibrated in accordance with the Gell Institute's Public Life Data Protocol, Open Data Standard. As Sidewalk's Jacqueline Liu and Matt Breuer explain, those standards make it possible to perform valuable comparisons between different public spaces and to export that data into visualizations and analysis tools, thus allowing both experts and community members to see patterns and make evidence-based, human-centered changes. Ananta Pandey reports that the Common Space team experimented with more high-tech modes of data collection, including cameras and computer vision, but opted for in-person mapping approaches because they led to stronger studies. When community members participate, they not only add important local context, but subsequently tend to become more active participants in the planning process, they said. Public life studies, Liu and Breuer claim, are an example of how small data, collected intentionally by people for a specific purpose, can help make cities better. Sidewalk made its open source code available on GitHub in March of 2019 in order to seek feedback and encourage third-party development, but there's been no online activity since April, and the Common Space website is gone, and the Wayback Machine says nothing has happened there since April either. Yet small data are harvested in 307's Common Space, too. Exhibition designers Daily Tous les Jours say they've created a set of colorful, rolling, modular, stackable, playful interactive tools that turn 307 into a place for input, plus discussion, plus experimentation, plus new ideas, plus action. The workspace is itself an inhabitable model, a platform for Sidewalk team members to observe behavior, conduct informal interviews and focus groups, pilot test new urban features, collect data, and iterate inside the building's walls, and eventually implement in the docklands outside. 307's humble material objects, concrete and chipboard, post-its, and foam blocks, are rhetorical tools suggesting that here cities are workshopped. Urban futures and data plans are co-created from a mix of open platforms and public knowledge. 307, we might say, is a participatory map writ large. The aesthetic and ethos of the workspace is a far cry from that of Sidewalk Lab's original headquarters in New York's Hudson Yards development, which I wrote a piece about a few years ago, where the team provided digital master planning support for developers related in Oxford properties, both of which I think have a foot in Canada as well. As Matt Shaw explained in the Architect's newspaper, because the New York development is on state-owned land, there was no oversight from community boards. The parcel became part of a larger economic development strategy that usurps local regulation, leaving the citizens of New York City more or less out of the conversation. That meant minimal design review and public process, which, even if it had happened, wouldn't have swayed related anyway. Former Housing Commissioner Rafael Castero told Crain's New York back in 2012 that Related's lack of fear of public process, bureaucracy, and unions is what allows them to be the players they are, one that redraws maps with little regard for what gets erased in the process. Sidewalk, now in the developer seat in Toronto, has taken a very different tack, and they've sought to cultivate a public persona much unlike Related's in New York. Among those differences is the fervor of Sidewalk's public process and documentation in Canada. Media scholar M.R. Souder acknowledges that Sidewalk Toronto has amassed an immense archive on its website, which echoes, the material design aesthetics of both 307 and the Google empire. They write, in addition to the 200-odd page vision document released when the deal was originally announced in October of 2017, there are videos, press releases, blog posts, white papers, artistic and architectural renderings, photos from public events, and reports. Now we add maps as well, stacked on reports of Sidewalk's technological innovations and public engagement exercises. This Sidewalk Toronto website contains an overwhelming cascade of documentation. As designer and urban scholar Kevin Rogan notes, Sidewalk's first wave of spatial images, part of their 2017 response to the request for proposals, are rendered in SketchUp but meant to look like illustrations. Their hand-drawn quality alludes to the hypothetical humans behind the design and the purported humanism of the design, while also implying that the renderings are works in progress, mere imaginings subject to public input. They're diagrammatic and didactic, reminiscent of the complex cutaways in children's books like David McCulley's The Way Things Work, Souder says. Sidewalk's 4-volume Master Innovation and Development Plan, published in just this past June, features a virtual encyclopedia of graphic styles, elementary Richard Scarry-like drawings, photorealistic renderings, dramatic portraiture, abstracted maps, data visualizations, and those flat illustrations so common on big tech world interfaces, which Rachel Hawley argues deploy cheerful minimalism in order to mask the insidiousness of multinational tech corporations, end quote. Each mode of visualization makes a different epistemological claim. This is speculative, well, that's really how it's going to be. This is fanciful, well, that is empirical. The contents of those graphics are themselves highly varied. They convey facts and figures and flows and feelings. Design critic Alexander Lang, responding to the newly released architectural renderings, proclaimed on Twitter, "There's almost too much 21st century urbanism in these sidewalk Toronto renderings. Kites, kayaks, leftover industrial equipment, painted cunning colors, permeable pavements, everything you can imagine. The too muchness of it all, the kites and kiosks, the cards and colors, the workshops, the maps, the open source code, the exhaustive archive, adds up to a form of engagement theater," according to public tech advocate Bianca Wiley. 307 follows in the tradition of the EU's urban living labs, sites where, since the 1990s, municipalities have developed, tried out, and innovated urban solutions, and that's solutions in scare quotes again, a real-life context. As Georgia Nesty explains, such labs allow urban governments, and increasingly, in the age of smart cities, their corporate tech partners, to pilot test projects on products in a fast timeline with minimal bureaucracy and with minimalized consequences for failure, which is framed here as an ordinary externality of innovation. So you're just going to fail, that's part of the process. Such smart city engagement arenas, which would also include hackathons and things like data boot camps, fit with the European Commission's neoliberal vision for urban development, Rob Kitchen argues, as well as with the entrepreneurial municipalities' ideas about citizens needing to be seen to participate in the smart city. The city of Boston is engaging, I think I'm on the right slide, the city of Boston is engaging in a similar experiment. Their Beta Blocks project consists of 3 exploration zones, pilot tests of urban technology like sidewalk displays or camera-based sensors in 3 neighborhoods. They also have a roving inflatable exhibition featuring such technology and discussions about its effective and equitable implementation, as well as various community engagement groups. Project designers Supernormal call Beta Blocks a partnership, which is a partnership with local government, Emerson College, tech companies, and city residents. They call it both a block-level technology experimentation zone and a civic learning and experimentation process. Strategic designers and urban innovators, that's what they call themselves, Indy Johar, Jane Engel, and Jonathan LaPalme propose that such labs might even be a place to engage in regulatory experimentation. They could pave the way to a whole new governance model that realigns the pace of technology and regulation and enable both to embrace and learn from real-time feedback, end quote. This is precisely what Sidewalk Labs was hoping for at 307 and in the Quayside neighborhood for which it served as a training ground, to build new tech-friendly public-private modes of smart urban governance that work essentially at the pace of tech development. So 307's visitors inhabit and co-create an urban model. They generate a qualitative data set that will then eventually be mapped onto the landscape outside. That real-world terrain will meanwhile conjure up its own map. In the June 2019 Master Innovation and Development Plan, Sidewalk describes their intention to create a high-resolution, 3D, comprehensive digital map of the public realm, which would serve as a single repository for information about open spaces and related infrastructure, creating a shared foundation for ongoing operations and proactive maintenance, end quote. The map, updated continuously via data, via data collected by sensors, by open space managers and users, would include all public spaces from parks to public libraries, amenities and physical infrastructures from benches to playground equipment, utility systems such as stormwater pipes and power grids, as well as shared participatory infrastructure like electrical outlets, public speakers, water fountains, Wi-Fi, and picnic tables. Each of these would have a sensor on it communicating its existence and its state of repair to this centralized map. And that mapping system would in turn scale out as an urban prototype for implementation in cities around the world. This map would rely largely on the passive participation of objects and people reduced to monitoring and reporting on those objects' condition. Such elements of 307 hinted at such limitations of urban agency. For example, in the showroom, we weren't permitted to play with the digital electricity demo or visit the upstairs offices. Other features simply announced their presence and expected us to deal with it. Perched high in a corner was a pair of gadgets, a white cylinder and a gray box, which, as a stencil and sans serif sign on a stand informed us, was a Numina sensor. Hello, it said. A low-resolution image of you may have been, probably was, taken in this area. This image is immediately de-identified and is only used to calibrate and validate pedestrian and vehicle movement in the area, end quote. No opt-in or opt-out, no solicitation of our opinion or request for consent. Numina simply is, as is, and it may have already taken our photo and mapped our location before we even knew of its existence. As urban tech consultant Nabil Ahmed reported in July, Sidewalk initially promised openness, releasing a public engagement plan in February 2 years ago, touting collaboration and co-creation to imagine this new neighborhood together. Despite an impressive array of activities that included public roundtables, design jams, neighborhood meetings, and a physical showcase for urban living technologies, 307 in other words, Sidewalk, he says, pushed forth its own agenda. Instead of addressing data governance, it talked about parks and public spaces. When it did share proposals, it preferred to present already fleshed out ideas with little room for debate, leaving conversations with residents to be a largely performative exercise. As Bianca Wiley told me, when Sidewalk shared maps, they sometimes used them to deceive. Quote, the scope of Sidewalk's plan was always well larger than Quayside. If Sidewalk would have started to show maps of the entire Portlands from day one and tied their intents and influence to that scope more broadly, some people would have had a very different reaction, end quote. While the kiosks and public forums focused on tall timber construction, modular pavers, and while the maps and plans typically train people's vision on a delimited territory, the team, behind the scenes, was hatching bigger plans and creating new technologies to automate collaboration and participation. CoLab, created in collaboration with a group called Digital Public Square, is a digital tool to increase civic participation and foster more inclusive, collaboratory community decisions, end quote. The prototype invites users to propose events in public spaces and review trade-offs associated with each proposal. In other words, if you have your picnic here, we can't have our community meeting in the same space. There's no shortage of similar digital participatory platforms and e-government tools that allow for information sharing, interaction, and co-production through, for example, collaborative mapping or policy co-design. Sidewalk's CoOrd, all of these similarly titled platforms, meanwhile, allows for city agencies, public drivers, mobility and logistics companies, and engineering firms to share data about curb real estate, from signs to curb cuts to curb paint, to improve compliance and inform policy planning. And its Replica, which is, if you've heard of any of these, you've probably heard of this one, it's gotten the most press, which spun out of Sidewalk Labs just a couple weeks ago into its own company, uses de-identified mobile data procured through mobile app publishers, data aggregators and telecom companies, so your mobile provider is likely providing data for them whether you know it or not, to create models of how people move in cities, what their commutes are like, how ride-sharing impacts traffic congestion, and how cyclists use the bike lanes. The tool maps these movement models onto a synthetic population generated through census demographic data, producing a simulated city on the move. Replica is working with Kansas City, Portland, Chicago, and Sacramento, and there are a host of other cities lining up to work with them, despite lots of highly publicized challenges to data privacy. So these projects involve participatory mapping and collaboration too, but that participation is mediated, filtered, aggregated, and in many cases automated and unwitting. It's gratuitously technologized too, some critics say. Waterfront Toronto's Digital Strategy Advisory Panel released a preliminary commentary just a couple weeks ago, and its authors agreed that many of the issues that these planning tools promise to address, things like traffic management and citizen participation, are indeed legitimate concerns. Yet they wondered whether a technical innovation was truly required. Some proposed solutions, they said, felt like tech for tech's sake. One member said, I don't understand the drive to move these things out of regular public governance if the desire is to work on behalf of the public good. Another, referencing Sidewalk Toronto's multi-layered master plan, said, "I would prefer to see these digital tools and services brought together more formally as a civic technology that is owned and executed by citizens." This, too, is engagement theater. It's mapping as smokescreen, civic tech as diversion. Sidewalk Labs has marshaled the aesthetics of participation to frame performative ethics as political action. As geographer and smart city scholar Rob Kitchen argues, citizen-centric design, or what some people call co-design, has largely acted, in many cases, acted as an empty signifier, designed to silence detractors and bring them into the fold, while now altering the technocratic workings, profit-driven orientation, or ethos of stewardship and civic paternalism of many smart city schemes. Kitchen, in his article, refers to places like Barcelona, Detroit, Seattle, and Amsterdam, many of which have won acclaim for their public processes. This is not to say that these cities' efforts are disingenuous or ineffectual, rather that the way in which ethics is operationalized and performed through citizen-centered processes merits scrutiny. Bertru Bakert, assistant professor of urban futures, what a great title, at University of Massachusetts Amherst, conducted several years of ethnographic research in Kansas City, which was an original Google Fiber city, if you remember that project. And she was there to better understand the process by which smartness is envisioned, negotiated, and materialized in an already existing city, rather than in an undeveloped district that lends itself to tabula rasa construction. At the many Code for KC and Digital Divide meetings and Smart City public events Bakert attended, she said, maps and how we should rethink the city-type map questions that we are asked for over maps always appeared at some point. I think because the city's historic racial divide is so visually obvious that it immediately communicated why any intervention would be justified. It was also, she said, an efficient way to make the attendees feel like they did something collectively. Because even though maps were rarely central to the outcomes of those meetings, they offered a moment to talk over a concrete object and do something about it together. It didn't usually take more than an hour to do the mapping exercise, but that hour was often the only time we talked to one another, she said. Maybe the maps offered a platform on which different epistemic communities could work together without reproducing hierarchical power structures, which designers Eduardo Sazowski and Benjamin Winter regard as critical for social innovation. Yet Bakert found that map-making sometimes seemed to be an end in itself. She was confused by the constant reaffirmation of well-known problems via new maps. She recalled a digital divide meeting in which a city official showed years-old data with which the team was well familiar and was actually the very reason for their having met together for months, but in a new dashboard designed by an analytics company. Bakert said she asked what we could take away from this map since we already knew there was a digital divide across neighborhoods, which elicited defensive comments from other attendees, who said that the dashboard constituted a new visual tool which they could use to discuss the phenomenon with their constituents and funders. Even though it didn't contain any new information, and there were many existing maps using the very same data, Bakert said, this particular map looked smarter and therefore more useful. Continual graphic upgrades seem to get in the way of using the map as a step toward taking meaningful action. I'm puzzled, she said, by how the technical capabilities of a dashboard map could so mundanely get in the way of politics or public action. Even in the not-so-smart parts of the city where analog maps address analog urban problems, we observe similar political processes. Fernando Cantelli de Castro, an urban designer and architect who wrote his graduate thesis on grassroots community movements fighting displacement, found that the participatory frameworks implemented by New York City's Department of City Planning's I lost my place here, sorry. He framed them as opportunities for empowerment. These workshops instead functioned more like marketing campaigns. They reduced community engagement to simple exercises designed to educate communities about zoning through technocratic lenses. Presentations typically adhered to a rigid schedule and scripted dialogue. There is no spatial casual conversation, he recounted. And that directed conversation, as in Kansas City, often revolved around a concrete visual, which set the agenda and tone for conversation. Proposed plans were often shared via hand-drawn streetscape perspectives, idyllic images of an unpredictable future, a future that, while visually appealing, could also involve the participants' own displacement. Maps, too, were present in every community meeting, where participants commonly organized into working groups guided by a facilitator. Cantelli de Castro, in his roles as a designer and city planner, often created those maps himself in preparation for the community meetings. They appeared in slide decks, and they were plotted in large sizes and placed at the middle of groups' tables. In general, he said, the maps are pretty busy graphically and highlight the open spaces, public amenities, roads, and other urban nodes. They're drafted with the intention to inform and to entertain by allowing neighbors to attach stickers and notes to create their own collective palimpsest. When later in the office we try to interpret what the neighbors are communicating through those stickers and notes, we find isolated ideas and anecdotes, but hardly something that influences the project. Ultimately, instead of collectivizing the decision-making process, Cantelli de Castro argues, these participatory practices instead serve to corroborate the experts' proposals. While Cantelli de Castro made clear the maps that they used in public workshops weren't intended to manipulate or coerce, they did function, like Sidewalk Lab's maps in Toronto, as marketing tools and rhetorical documents. As he explained to me, the maps focused participants' attention on a delimited territory by highlighting the project boundary, which you can see kind of in a red line. In other words, focus here, don't look on the world outside. Any development that happened will all stay neatly within these lines, which obviously is not always the case. So these attractive, exhaustive, didactic tools also serve to educate the community unschooled in planning, to help them reimagine the unavoidable future of growth or change. Yet Cantelli de Castro also saw the potential for bilateral education. These participatory maps could and should be used to educate the planners themselves, to show those spatial patterns that are lived realities for community residents, but invisible to planners and politicians, to surface what isn't represented in the official data. One urban phenomenon that isn't represented in the official data, or at least data that are commonly accessible to the general public, and which is among the common unidentified consequences of rezoning, redevelopment, and smartification, is eviction. When I asked the aforementioned researchers and designers if they could identify mapping projects that had the potential to pose potent resistance to neoliberal urbanism and algorithmic planning, several folks mentioned eviction maps. As anti-eviction mapping project founder Erin McElroy told me, and as we've seen through several of the examples we've already explored, community mapping really is just a tool that can help produce an array of futures, depending upon who designs and uses it. It can be used to embolden techno-capitalism, as is the case with Sidewalk Labs, or to produce anti-capitalist futures. It all depends on who the community is comprised of, users and developers alike. There are also, McElroy acknowledges, plenty of community groups that are using maps to fight for social justice and various genres, and who have been very impactful. The Anti-Eviction Project, McElroy notes, has produced maps and other resources on serial evictors. And she writes, by connecting eviction data, property ownership data, and business data, and by creating public-facing online maps, we've been able to identify large corporate landlord entities who often hide behind a web of shell companies, which affords them anonymity. We've made this data available to the public to help put pressure on evictors and stop particular evictions. In this way, our mapping feeds on-the-ground tenant organizing and helps build connections. The irony is that in the Anti-Evictions Project's core terrains, so the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, and New York, it's often tech companies like Alphabet or Google who try to hide their own affiliation with organizations like Sidewalk Labs, and those companies incite the cost of living increases in eviction. So they're the contributors to eviction, yet their tools also provide convenient means to map that very kind of displacement. So McElroy is keenly aware of the politics embedded in mapping technologies and modalities, and of the limitations of the map itself. The AEMP, Anti-Eviction Project, describes itself as much more than a map. It's a data visualization, data analysis, and digital storytelling collective documenting dispossession and resistance among gentrifying landscapes. That's how they describe themselves. That collective, composed of housing justice activists, researchers, technologists, activists, filmmakers, and oral historians, has produced over 100 digital interactive web maps, roughly the same number of oral histories and videos, and an array of articles and reports and zines, interactive murals, and events. AEMP began in 2013 with traditional maps. then expanded to incorporate oral histories and narratives because, as McElroy says, eviction markers and chloropleths on Cartesian maps, as useful and actionable as they can be, tended to reduce complex life stories and neighborhood histories to dots on a map. These other formats also enabled them to expand beyond maps of loss to incorporate stories of resistance and perhaps even kind of success. Their new Counterpoints, a San Francisco Bay Area Atlas for Displacement and Resistance, forthcoming next year, provides additional historical and critical context to the map work. Quote, "We recognize the importance of maintaining a critique of the tech boom and the dispossession it incites." In other words, we want to acknowledge the fact that so much of what we're talking about is a result of new media of today, but they also don't want to deracinate displacement from its historical roots. The new book will examine such factors as indigenous geographies, environmental racism, transportation and infrastructure, migration, and speculation. And their Dislocation series, which includes a print and online zine and a public workshop series, allows them to use arts-based methods to amplify the narratives and resistance of communities facing displacement. Dislocation, they explain, was born out of an interest in humanizing data made visible by our quantitative maps. Committed to challenging traditional notions of where knowledge resides and who gets to make it, the project foregrounds the voices of those often left out of the official historical record. McElroy and Manissa Marwal describe their realization that archiving, mapmaking, and political organizing can be intertwined and symbiotic, treated as important tools in an arsenal of tactics and strategies for resistance, placemaking, and political community building. The Hyderabad Urban Lab operates under a similar premise. They generate urban research through maps, classes, exhibitions, manuals, and social media, and by connecting with other community groups and social movements. So both of these practices, and I'm sure the others we're going to see throughout the day today, recognize that ultimately it's not about the maps alone. And this brings me back to that edited collection about crowdsourced mapping I mentioned at the very beginning. One of the things I most admired about that book was that its authors, who dedicated years and careers to activist mapping, acknowledged that maps alone are rarely sufficient to achieve social and environmental change, to effect policy reform, or to incite political revolution. Instead, crowdsourced collaborative mapping, revolutionary as it might have been at its inception, is best framed as merely one tool, albeit a critical one, for rallying local and global communities, for lobbying politicians, for deploying resources on the ground, for inciting the exchange of embodied skills and knowledge. It's really not about the maps, as I'm sure, again, we'll see throughout the day today. It's often about the larger atlases and cartographic assemblages they generate. It's about how those maps can help us plot out more inclusive, engaged, justice-oriented spatial practices. It's about the archives and the small, local, living data sets that are created and engaged to create the map, which then serve myriad purposes beyond the map. It's about the public processes which the map gives rise to, and the publics that emerge around it, which then go on to do other non-mappy things together. It's about the inevitable plurality or partiality and excesses of our maps and how they create productive moments of contestation that give people an opportunity to imagine different forms of society or to engage politically with their social world. It's about the acts of care and the practices of maintenance required to sustain those maps and their communities. It's about the embodied practices of activism they inspire. It's about the new worlds they help us imagine and create. Thank you.
So, Shannon, thank you for what was, I think, a necessary, sobering beginning to your talk, and a more hopeful ending to it, which I hopefully will launch us in that direction for the rest of our day together. I want to ask a brief question to get us started, and then get out of the way, and give us about 15 minutes for conversation. And I do want to ask you a little bit about effectively the question that you framed for us towards the beginning, which is about how maps can become something more than just a process of, or social justice-minded maps can be involved in something more than simply the process of bearing witness. Do you tend to think of these things as sequential? I mean, to what extent is bearing witness to the kinds of practices that you outlined there, eviction, patterns of eviction, mapping out the structures that make eviction possible that are hidden. To what extent is that a sort of a necessary precondition for the type of constructive work that you're talking about later on? Or is it possible to jump to that latter project right away for people who want to get really, want to get at it?
I don't know if there's necessarily one prescriptive sequence of events by which social change can happen. Mapping is a way for distributed communities or communities who don't necessarily see themselves represented cartographically to recognize one another's existence. At the same time, in some cases, there are vulnerabilities that come along with that rendering visible. For example, I've taken my maps class to, I mentioned the Office for Creative Research, which sadly does not exist anymore. And they've worked a lot with National Geographic and other conservation efforts. And one of the projects they worked on was the Great Elephant Atlas, I think it was called. And one of their challenges is how do you render visible the tragic decimation of elephant populations, yet not call specific granular attention to where specifically that's happening, thereby rendering them even more vulnerable. So we do raise questions as to whether plotting on the map is an advantageous or potentially unintentionally disadvantageous precursor to bringing communities together and affecting change of some sort. So there's definitely not a one right way to do it, but I do think it is a very, as again, I'm sure we're going to see throughout the day today, a very empowering opportunity for distributed and invisible populations to recognize one another's existence and maybe their shared concerns.
I'd like to open it up to the rest of the room.
Hi, good morning. I have a question about art-based methods, using art-based methods in mapping process. The process itself yields so much rich information and participation in sort of a non-traditional way. And having worked in using those methods in research and in community work, I'm wondering what you think once the work is produced, where the utility can be beyond that for folks who are not as familiar with the value of that work and how that can be furthered in policy making and decision making and community work, sort of taking it just from the valuable process of it into another realm so that it's more effective and transformative.
So we have a whole panel that's going to talk about that later this afternoon. So maybe some of them have things they'd like to say, those who are in there, like Lizzie and the other folks from. But one thing I'll just mention, one case study. I showed an image from the St. Louis map room, which is now something that Jer Thorpe and Yanni Lukasis, both people I mentioned earlier in my talk, are trying to open source. They're trying to essentially create not necessarily a kit of parts, but an online web resource to allow cities anywhere, and they do have international interested collaborators to make their own map rooms. And some cities are then incorporating those maps into their their municipal archives, or using them as kind of starters for conversation for different types of planning processes. So that's one example, just validating the work that's produced by those arts-based methods enough to say that, like, this is a form of valid urban data that we are actually going to put into the city's official record now. That itself can be empowering, and then it can become a data source, like a base map for future work to build upon. So that's just one small example, but maybe some of the other arts folks in the room have other things they'd like to add to that.
Hi, I had like two kind of takeaways for myself in our own work from what you presented, and one is something that's oftentimes really lacking in people doing GIS work, which is humility and self-examination. So I'm really happy to see that start us off for the day. And then the second thing is to always be asking the question, to what end? But I want to hear from you, like if you were to give us some sort of guidelines for a framework to keep in our minds as we move forward with our work. We're starting to work with high school kids. It's really important to me that we're being, really careful about how we move forward. So I'm just wondering if you would add something to those two takeaways, what would you add?
I think humility is definitely a very good place to start, and also recognizing, and this is something that a term that probably won't mean much maybe to high school kids, but like spatial ontologies. presenting the fact that space is not always property, political boundaries are not the only way to think about space, that there are other modes of like resource management that aren't about extraction, for instance. And this is where, again, I hate to keep going back to like indigenous mapping, but there are plenty of examples of historical, post-colonial forms of mapping, indigenous maps that definitely do show different spatial epistemologies that I think are really important to show, particularly people of high school, college students, that points, lines, and areas and political boundaries aren't really the only way to represent how space works, how we can understand space, what relationships we have to space. And one methodology, I think a pedagogical methodology that's worked really well for me, is to have students make atlases. So if they choose a research project, I kind of say you have to have 5 different modes of cartography here. One has to be GIS-based, and the others have to be anything but GIS-based, to see how you can explore the same topic through different modes of cartography. What GIS allows you to do that the others don't, and vice versa. So I think that can be a really sensory mapping, kind of accessibility mapping that deals with people with kind of with different forms of disability. I mean, I think these all then open up different dimensions of spatial epistemology and ontology.
Yeah, I'm really interested in how the kind of work that we're talking about here today challenges traditional disciplinary boundaries in higher education. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to where the humanities fit in the frameworks that you're talking about.
That's a very good question. I think even just some of the topics we've addressed thus far, with the role of arts education and like the greater liberal arts or public scholarship or the public humanities, how these very topics we're talking about, the methodologies we're talking about, definitely expand beyond something that's only useful in a university classroom. These are great things for a community to engage in a public budgeting, public planning process. The development of humility, asking these larger questions of to what end are we doing these things and building these engagement apps, what should be mapped and what shouldn't be mapped. I mean, even just the idea that mapping is maybe an inappropriate methodology in some cases. That's not to say that folks in the social sciences or GIS, for instance, are not equipped to answer those questions, but I think having folks who maybe have a different theoretical toolbox at their disposal can maybe add a different dimension to asking those larger teleological questions and methodological questions.
Hi, thanks for a great presentation. So I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to how companies that are interested in gathering algorithmic data prioritize abstracted representations versus perhaps aerial views and photographic representations, which have historically been interpreted or valorized by architects, planners, others as a more holistic way of seeing the world versus atomistic top-down.
Well, this is one of the reasons I chose and spoke maybe at too much length about the Sidewalk Lab projects, because of the variety of different rhetorical, visual rhetorics they use, specifically so they can essentially hit all bases and make an argument that's going to suit whatever target population they have in mind. So, for example, as Bertru Bakert I mentioned, or as Fernando Cantelli de Castro talked about, some of the abstract representations serve to, well, like massing diagrams in architecture, for instance, doesn't offer too much specificity. It encourages you just to think it like abstracted geometric scales, for instance, which removes your attention from small architectural details and construction implementation, for instance. So they really serve as rhetorical dimensions in terms of framing how the discussion is going to be applied based on how much abstraction or detail is provided. My first book was about library design, and I went around the country and looked at 15 cities that were designing new public library buildings in an age when Amazon was rising and everybody thought the library was dead or soon to be. And one thing I found is the choice of photorealistic renderings or hyper-realistic models often prove to be very alienating to a community. When you're opening up a public process and you present a visual that seems like a fait accompli, there seems to be no room for access, essentially. So other people, I mean, I think it has different resonances with different populations, but in terms of its utility in a public process, that seemed to essentially shut down conversation in many cases. So just thinking about the potential effects, even unintended consequences of the different modes that you're mixing together, that's just a really important starting point for the suite of representational strategies you're using in any type of project like this.
So I was intrigued by one of the comments from the people who were providing feedback on this planning process. I can't remember which slide it was, but it was about why is this supplanting a more traditional planning process, a more government-driven or policy-driven planning process. And I'm wondering about, so what does Google get out of Sidewalk? I mean, they get data, right? But it's clearly part of their business model. And what does that do I mean, and all of the beautiful, performative, very busy Toronto waterfront that was rendered by in this charrette workspace that is basically a performance from how you interpreted it. What does that do in terms of our structures of actually making decisions and taking responsibility for what our spaces are going to be and who's responsible for them?
So is the question, what does it do for Alphabet, or what does it do for the public who's exposed to and participating in these actions?
I mean, I think it's both. I mean, is there just a shift from what civil society is responsible for to what corporate interests are driving towards?
I think the answer to that is yes, and that's why I think we have to think through, again, about the political rhetorics of the strategies that are being used here, especially as more and more municipalities are partnering with external and using, procurement sounds like such a boring thing to study, but it is so important how cities procure software and kind of external packages, how they're using Palantir to help with law enforcement, how they're partnering with Alphabet and Microsoft for surveillance systems, for instance. So being aware of the really boring bureaucratic aspect of procurement, the nature of those contracts, and as that happens more frequently, because city tech, internal tech companies just cannot keep up with the pace of development of kind of a lot of corporate tech development, I think there is more of a public-private partnership model, and that does shift the role of citizen participation. In terms of what Alphabet gets out of it, I mean, if, they have in many cases, particularly in their implementation of the Link kiosks, the public Wi-Fi kiosks in the UK, tried to obfuscate their connection to Google. But if you think of it, they have Waze, the kind of the navigation app, they have self-driving cars and Waymo, they have Google Maps, they have ads, they have Google, the Google Map kind of platform itself, all very conveniently integrated, that provide this kind of ubiquitous, universal, self-contained universe of data. So it's probably all ultimately yielding kind of advertising revenue and contracts as they contract their services out to other cities. What's happening in Toronto is they often talk about building a test bed that will then scale up or scale out kind of the Silicon Valley model to other cities, and we see that with Replica. They built it, I think, initially in Portland, and now other cities are contracting with them. So that's the revenue generating possibility. Or the reason I think Toronto was maybe so participatory is that Hudson Yards was so not. There was no public participation at all, and we have some Toronto folks here today, so maybe they could talk a bit more about this, but maybe there's a greater expectation that there will be. I wrote my dissertation on the Seattle Public Library, where there's an expectation that you're going to have a public process around a new design project. I imagine that's more so the case maybe in Toronto than there was in New York. So.
Time for one more.
Thanks, Connor. Thank you so much, Dr. Mattern. I really appreciate your talk. And my question actually dovetails off of this same exact point that I think was you could sense in the room. A lot of people felt something with that notion, that question of why is a public governance, something that should be public governance being abdicated, if you will, to these companies. It's very compelling, I think, to situate that in a story of economic change and neoliberalism, and that's fun. But I'm also wondering if you could speak a little bit to whether that displaces not only sort of a public governance structure or a history of public endeavor that has become private, but also might displace the traditional social sciences and the academic study of place and give some of that work also to companies. I sense a little bit of that too in all of this mapping, all of this sort of data making there has been a role for that in social sciences, often at public institutions. I'm wondering if you could speak to sort of an analogous neoliberalized shift there.
Yeah, definitely. You can see what's happening in Pittsburgh, where not the ubiquity, but the arrival of Uber and other tech companies is essentially poaching a lot of mostly roboticists and computer scientists, but also perhaps social scientists from Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh. So a lot of maybe smaller scale cities with the influx of tech companies, you do see a movement of people in various academic fields to the tech companies and away from the university. And again, just the proprietarization of data sets creates great methodological challenges for researchers to have access to that information anymore. So again, if you're going to contract to develop a procurement agreement with an external service to provide resources that were once done in-house, you then lose the ability to control that data. So several cities, there was an article in BuzzFeed 2 summers ago about several cities using Palantir to essentially develop like a data resource management system for a lot of their criminal justice and policing activities. And when they decided that maybe they didn't like the terms of the deal and they wanted to get out of it, they no longer had control of any of the data that had been put into that platform over the course of the previous years. So those are risks that run not only to cities, but also to researchers who want access to archival data also.
Thank you so much, and please join us after the break for our first panel on mapping racial violence.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks.